Forget what you think you know. Erase the image of the blockbuster action heroes, the catchy rap songs, and the comforting idea that there is a thin black line protecting the Earth from the scum of the universe. That is the greatest trick the phenomenon ever pulled. It turned a source of genuine existential terror into a toy line. The reality of the Men in Black is not about protection. It is about suppression. It is about the smell of ozone and burning rubber in a bedroom at 3 in the morning. It is about entities that look like men, but move like insects, wearing suits that seem to be cut from a fabric that does not exist in this decade. They are the silencers from the threshold, the antibodies of a reality that is trying to reject the truth. From the tragic waters of Maury Island to the dark room where Albert Bender screamed into the void, this is not a story about government agents. This is a story about the things that wear our shape, to tell us to stop looking at the sky. They are the glitches in the Matrix. They are the tulpas of our collective paranoia. And they are watching. To understand the disease, we must find patient zero. In the mythology of the flying saucer, the public consciousness usually starts at Roswell in July of 1947, or perhaps with Kenneth Arnold seeing the Silver Crescent skipping over Mount Rainier on June 24th. But the timeline of the silencers begins before both of them. It begins 3 days before Arnold, on the grayscale waters of the Puget Sound in Washington state. The date is June 21st, 1947. The location is the cold, choppy water off the eastern shore of Maury Island. Harold Dahl is a scavenger, a man who makes his living pulling wayward logs from the Sound on his patrol boat, the North Queen. It is a mundane, gritty existence. Dahl is not a man looking for little green men. He is looking for timber. On this day, he is accompanied by his son, Charles, 2 crewmen, and the family dog. The silence of that June afternoon is not broken by a sighting, but by a violation. Dahl looks up to see 6 large objects hovering 2,000 feet above his boat. They are not the sleek discs of later science fiction. They are described as donut-shaped, possessing a heavy, industrial metallic quality. 5 of them are circling a 6th one in the center, which seems to be struggling. It is listing, unstable, like an engine in distress. This is where the Maury Island incident diverges from the passive lights in the sky reports that would follow. This encounter has physical weight. The center craft shudders and ejects a massive volume of superheated material. Dahl calls it slag. It looks like lava rock and light metal, raining down from the sky in a molten hail. There is no wonder here, only panic. The debris slams into the North Queen. The water boils. The windshield of the pilot house shatters, but the damage to the machinery is secondary. Dahl's son, Charles, is struck by the falling slag. The burns are severe, searing the skin of his arm. The family dog is not so lucky. The animal is struck by a heavy chunk of the superheated rock and is killed instantly. We must pause and appreciate the violence of this moment. The UFO phenomenon does not enter our history as a peaceful observation. It enters as an assault. A child is burned. A beloved pet is slaughtered. The North Queen limps back to shore, carrying a terrified crew and the physical evidence of an impossible event. If the story ended there, it would be a compelling footnote in ufology. But the true horror begins the next morning. And it begins with a knock at the door. On June 22nd, 1947, a man comes to see Harold Dahl. This is the moment the archetype is born. The visitor is driving a black 1947 Buick sedan. It is a detail that matters. In 1947, a brand new Buick is a symbol of power, of status, of the machinery of the state. The man himself is wearing a black suit. It is pristine. In the rugged, salt-worn world of a maritime scavenger, this man looks like he has been cut out of a magazine and pasted into reality. He invites Dahl to breakfast at a local diner in Tacoma. It seems civil. It seems like a standard interview. But when they sit down, the dynamic shifts. The man does not ask Dahl what happened. He tells him. He recites the events of the previous afternoon with the precision of a recording device. He describes the 6 donut-shaped craft. He describes the slag. He describes the burns on Charles's arm. He describes the death of the dog. He knows things that Dahl has not yet spoken aloud. He possesses an omniscience that is immediately violating. Then comes the ultimatum, the phrase that will echo through the next 50 years of high strangeness. The man looks at Dahl and says, "What I have said is proof to you that I know a great deal more about this experience of yours than you will want to believe. Silence is your best security." He threatens Dahl. He threatens his family. This is the function of the men in black. They are not investigators. They are not curious. They are a stopgap. They are a firewall designed to prevent data from leaking into the general population. Dahl is terrified, but the story leaks anyway. He tells his supervisor, Fred Krisman. Krisman is a character who seems to exist at the nexus of 20th century conspiracy, a man who will later be investigated by Jim Garrison in connection with the Kennedy assassination. Krisman goes to Maury Island. He finds the slag. He verifies the story. The tangible nature of the debris attracts the attention of the United States government. This is not a rumor. There are buckets of this rock. J. Edgar Hoover takes a personal interest. The FBI is watching, but more immediately, the Army Air Corps gets involved. 2 intelligence officers, Captain William Davidson and Lieutenant Frank Brown, are dispatched to interview Dahl and Krisman. They see the slag, they take samples, they board a B-25 bomber to fly the evidence back to Hamilton Field in California. They never make it. The B-25 catches fire and crashes near Kelso, Washington. Both Davidson and Brown are killed. The first 2 official investigators into the phenomenon are dead within weeks of the sighting. The slag they were carrying is lost, presumably destroyed or recovered by teams we will never know about. This tragedy solidifies the threat of the man in black in the Buick. His warning to Dahl was not a bluff. Silence is your best security. The alternative is death. When we analyze the Maury Island entity, we see the proto-MIB. He is distinct from the monsters we will encounter later in this documentary. He drives a car. He eats breakfast. He speaks in complete sentences. He represents the post-war anxiety of the G-man. In 1947, the scariest thing the American public could imagine was not a demon or an interdimensional vampire. It was the state. It was the government agent who knew your secrets, who knew where your children slept, and who could make your plane crash if you asked too many questions. The Maury Island MIB is the manifestation of the national security state. He is the cold, bureaucratic face of a government that has decided the truth is too dangerous for the common man. But the FBI files on this case reveal something even stranger. Agent Jack Wilcox wrote to Hoover that Dahl eventually claimed the story was a hoax. But looking closer at the files, Dahl didn't admit he lied. He admitted that he would call it a hoax to avoid further trouble. He was silenced. The mechanism worked. The dog was dead. The officers were dead. The witness was terrified into recanting. The men in black had won their first victory. But Maury Island was just the prologue. It was a physical threat for a physical encounter. As we move into the 1950s, the phenomenon changes. It becomes less about the government and more about something ancient and impossible. We are leaving the realm of Buicks and diners and entering the ticking, clock-filled room of a man named Albert Bender. And what comes for him is not a G-man. It is a trinity of terror that will break his mind. If Maury Island was the prologue, a physical warning shot fired across the bow of a scavenger boat, then the story of Albert K. Bender is the first act of the tragedy. It is the moment the phenomenon moved indoors. It left the cold waters of the Puget Sound and entered the domestic sanctity of the American home. It is here, in the industrial gloom of Bridgeport, Connecticut, that the men in black cease to be government agents and become something far worse. They become monsters. To understand the terror of 1953, we must first understand the victim. History has flattened Albert K. Bender into a footnote, a quirky name on a list of UFO enthusiasts, but he was more than that. He was a man out of time. He was a factory clerk by day, a faceless cog in the post-war economic machine. But by night, he was the master of a very different domain. He lived in the attic of his stepfather's house at 784 Broad Street. To call it an apartment is generous. It was a sanctuary. It was a chamber of horrors. Long before he looked up at the saucers, Bender looked into the dark. He was an obsessive devotee of the macabre, a collector of horror memorabilia, and a student of the occult. His walls were not covered in family photos, but in artwork of the grotesque, demons, skulls, and scenes from the films of the fantastic that he adored. But the most unsettling detail of Bender's life, the one that sets the stage for the madness to come, was the sound. Albert Bender owned chiming clocks. Not one or two, but 20 of them. In that small, cramped attic, the air was thick with the constant, rhythmic ticking of mechanical time. It was a symphony of gears and springs, a relentless, polyrhythmic heartbeat that filled every silence. Every 15 minutes, a cacophony of bells would ring out, fracturing the quiet, announcing the passage of time in a room that felt detached from the rest of the world. It was in this environment, a space already tuned to the frequency of high strangeness, a space that felt more like a wizard's tower than a clerk's bedroom, that Bender founded the International Flying Saucer Bureau in 1952, the IFSB. The name sounds official, grand, global. And in a way it was. It was the first major civilian UFO organization in the world. From his attic, surrounded by the ticking of his clocks, Bender was coordinating a network of investigators that stretched across continents. He published a newsletter called Space Review, a typed and mimeographed journal that was mailed to members in the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand. Bender was the spider in the center of a web of information. He was soliciting reports, gathering data, and corresponding with the leading minds of the day. He was not a passive observer. He was a hunter. He wanted the answer. He wanted to know what the sources were, where they came from, and what they wanted with us. And in the late summer of 1953, he made the mistake of finding out. Bender began to write letters to his closest associates. The tone of his correspondence shifted. The excitement of the hobbyist was replaced by the frantic energy of a man who has stumbled onto a dangerous secret. He claimed he had cracked the code. He had correlated data points that no one else had seen. He had a theory about the origin of the flying saucers that was so potent, so undeniable, that he planned to publish it in the October issue of Space Review. He wasn't just going to speculate. He was going to name names. He was going to expose the source. He wrote to a friend, outlining his theory, testing the waters. He put the letter in the mail. He didn't know it then, but he had just signed his own warrant. The letter was the trigger. The mechanism of suppression had been activated. The visitation did not happen all at once. It began with the atmosphere. In the weeks leading up to the final encounter, the attic at 784 Broad Street began to change. Bender reported strange smells. The acrid tang of burning sulfur, the sharp bite of ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. He began to suffer from dizzy spells, sudden onsets of vertigo that would send him reeling against his work desk. He felt watched. Not the paranoia of a lonely man, but the primal hair-raising sensation of being observed by a predator. The the ticking of the clock seemed to get louder. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, to detach themselves from the walls. And then the door opened, or rather, it didn't. It was September. Evening. Bender was alone in the attic. He was lying on his bed, nursing one of the splitting headaches that had become his constant companion. He closed his eyes, trying to escape the pain, trying to escape the feeling of dread that had settled over the house like a shroud. When he opened them, the room had changed. 3 men were standing there. They had not used the stairs. They had not opened the door. They had simply manifested. Bender described a sudden shift in air pressure, a coalescence of blue mist that solidified into 3 distinct figures. They were dressed in black suits. But these were not the suits of the FBI. They were too perfect, too black. The fabric seemed to absorb the light of the room. They wore Homburg hats, a style that was already drifting out of fashion, making them look like undertakers from a previous decade, or like actors wearing costumes they didn't quite understand. Bender sat up, paralyzed. He tried to speak, but his voice was gone. The air in the room was cold, unnaturally so, carrying that scent of sulfur and decay. He looked at their feet. They were not touching the floor. The 3 men were hovering, levitating just an inch or 2 above the dusty floorboards of the attic. It was a detail that shattered any illusion of reality. Government agents do not hover. But the true horror was in their faces, or what passed for faces. Bender described their eyes as glowing, not reflecting light, but generating it. They were like flashlight bulbs burning from within the skull, piercing, luminous, and utterly inhuman. They stared at him with a predatory intensity that froze him to the mattress. Their skin was pale, not the pallor of a sick man, but the color of parchment, the color of something that has never seen the sun. The figure in the center, clearly the leader, held something in his hand. It was a small, shiny object, a metal disc or a coin. He held it up to Bender's face. Bender found his gaze locked onto the object. As he stared at it, the pain in his head exploded. It was a psychic assault. He realized with a sickening jolt that the men were not speaking. Their lips were not moving. The voice was inside his head. It was a telepathic intrusion, cold and metallic. They told him that he was right. His theory, the one he had written down, the one he had mailed to his friend, was correct. He had found the truth. He had solved the riddle of the sources. And that was exactly why he had to stop. The communication was a mix of threats and bizarre, stilted logic. They didn't just threaten him with jail. They threatened him with the impossible. They told him that there were forces at work that humanity could not comprehend. They told him that the human race was not ready for the knowledge he possessed. Then, the leader spoke the words that would haunt Bender for the rest of his life. He invoked Bender's honor as an American. It was a jarring, discordant phrase. Why would an interdimensional entity, a being with glowing eyes that floated above the floor, care about American patriotism? It felt like a script. It felt like a line of dialogue chosen to manipulate a specific target, a clumsy attempt to mimic human authority. It was the uncanny valley in linguistic form. They were trying to sound like G-men, but the mask was slipping. They told him that if he published his theory, if he released the October issue with the truth, he would be responsible for something terrible. They showed him, mentally projected into his mind, a vision of what would happen. Bender never revealed exactly what they showed him, but it terrified him to his core. It was a vision of such bleak, cosmic horror that it broke his will instantly. "I forbid you to tell anyone," the voice said. "Silence is your best security." And then they were gone. They didn't walk out. They didn't vanish in a puff of smoke. They simply faded. The blue mist returned, the sulfur smell spiked, and the 3 figures dissolved back into the shadows of the attic. Bender was left alone with the ticking of his 20 clocks. The physical toll was immediate and severe. This was not a story he made up for attention. This was a trauma. Bender stopped eating. For 3 days, he couldn't hold down food. He lost weight rapidly. His co-workers at the factory saw a man who had aged 10 years in a weekend. He was trembling, pale, and genuinely terrified. The confident, boisterous director of the IFSB was gone, replaced by the paranoia of a hunted animal. He wouldn't look people in the eye. He jumped at shadows. When the phone rang, he stared at it as if it were a bomb. The UFO community was waiting. The subscribers to Space Review were expecting the revelation Bender had promised. They were waiting for the answer to the greatest mystery of the age. When the October 1953 issue finally arrived in mailboxes around the world, it was a tombstone. There was no theory. There was no exposure of the government. There was no map of the saucer bases. Instead, the issue contained a warning. In a stark, black-bordered box, looking like a death announcement, Bender wrote his final editorial. The mystery of the flying saucers is no longer a mystery. The source is already known, but any information about this is being withheld by orders from a higher source. We would like to print the full story in Space Review. But because of the nature of the information, we have been advised in the negative. Advised in the negative. It is one of the most chilling phrases in the history of the paranormal. It is a bureaucratic euphemism for terror. It implies a conversation. It implies that advice was given and that the consequences of ignoring that advice were too terrible to contemplate. Bender didn't just redact the article, he burned the house down. He dissolved the International Flying Saucer Bureau immediately. He shut down the network. He stopped the presses. He refunded subscriptions. He retreated into complete obscurity, refusing to speak about the event for nearly a decade. He wouldn't even answer the phone. When his friends, his fellow researchers, came to the house in Bridgeport to ask him what had happened, he refused to open the door. Or if he did, he would speak to them through the chain, his eyes wide and frightened, whispering that he couldn't talk, he couldn't say a word. They were listening. This is the Bender mystery. It is the moment the Men in Black became a legend. Because nothing confirms a conspiracy theory like silence. If Bender had published a crazy story about aliens in Antarctica, he would have been dismissed. He would have been laughed at. But by saying nothing, by destroying his own life's work and hiding in the shadows, he proved to his followers that the threat was real. The tragedy of Albert Bender is that he summoned the very thing he feared. His room, filled with ticking clocks and occult sigils, was a beacon. He wasn't just researching a phenomenon. He was participating in a ritual. He was pulling at a thread that was woven into the fabric of reality itself. And the entities that answered were not pilots or soldiers. They were the antibodies of that reality. They were the silencers. But silence, as it turns out, is a vacuum, and a vacuum demands to be filled. Bender's retreat left a gaping hole in the narrative of ufology, and into that hole stepped a man who didn't care about the truth. He didn't care about honor as an American, he only cared about the story. A man named Gray Barker was watching from West Virginia. He saw Bender's terror. He saw the potential, and he picked up his pen. He was about to turn Albert Bender's nightmare into a franchise, and in doing so, he would infect the entire world with the virus of the Men in Black. If Albert Bender was the patient zero of the Men in Black infection, then Gray Barker was the vector. He was the wind that carried the spore. Without him, the story of the silencers might have died in that attic in Bridgeport, buried under a pile of unsold Space Review newsletters. But Barker ensured that the silence would be heard around the world. To understand the Men in Black, you have to understand that they are not just a phenomenon, they are a genre, and Gray Barker was the author. Barker was a man operating out of Clarksburg, West Virginia. He was a cinema booker by trade, a man who understood the mechanics of the theater. He knew what put bodies in seats. He knew that the public didn't want dry scientific data about atmospheric anomalies. They didn't want weather balloons or swamp gas. They wanted a story. They wanted a villain. In 1956, 3 years after Bender was silenced, Barker published the book that would change the landscape of modern folklore forever. He titled it, "They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers." It was a masterpiece of paranoia. Before this book, the men in black were isolated rumors. They were whispers between terrified witnesses. But Barker took those whispers and screamed them. He took the Maury Island incident, the Flatwoods Monster, and the Bender mystery, and he stitched them together into a single terrifying tapestry. He gave the entities a name, he capitalized it, the men in black. He codified the look, the black suits, the black cars, the threatening demeanor. He took the disjointed experiences of lonely people and turned them into a grand unified conspiracy. He told his readers that there was a war going on for the truth and that the good guys were losing. The book was not an investigation. It was a contagion. It spread through the UFO community like wildfire. Suddenly, everyone was seeing men in dark suits. Every click on a telephone line became a wiretap. Every car parked on a quiet street became a surveillance unit. Barker had given the community a vocabulary for their fear. But who was Gray Barker, really? He is the most complex, contradictory, and perhaps the most dangerous figure in this history. He was a man of secrets in a time when secrets were dangerous. A closeted gay man living in conservative West Virginia in the 1950s, Barker understood the crushing weight of living a double life. He understood the fear of exposure. He understood what it meant to be watched, to be judged, to be silenced by a society that deemed his existence unacceptable. Perhaps that is why the story of the men in black resonated so deeply with him. It was a metaphor for his own reality, the fear of the knock at the door, the fear of the man in the suit who knows everything about you. But Barker was also a trickster, a coyote figure. He was the unreliable narrator of the 20th century. While he preached the gospel of the flying saucers to his paying customers, privately, he was laughing. We must look at the Straith letter to see the true face of the mythmaker. In 1957, Barker and his friend James Moseley, another titan of ufological mischief, decided to pull a prank that would become legendary. They obtained official stationery from the US State Department. On this stolen letterhead, they forged a letter to George Adamski, the most famous UFO contactee of the era. Adamski claimed to be in regular contact with beautiful blonde Venusians. He was a cult leader, a man who sold salvation from the stars. Barker and Moseley wrote to him as the Cultural Exchange Committee, a fictional government body. They signed it R.E. Straith. The letter confirmed everything Adamski had ever said. It told him the government knew he was telling the truth. It encouraged him to keep preaching. It was a lie. A cruel, hilarious, meticulously crafted lie. And it worked. Adamski swallowed the bait whole. He paraded the Straith letter around the world as the ultimate proof of his claims. He staked his reputation on a piece of paper forged by two men who were giggling in a back room in West Virginia. This was Gray Barker. He was a man who manufactured evidence. He created the Bender mystery just as much as he reported on it. He took the raw, chaotic data of reality and sculpted it into a narrative that would sell books. His sister famously quoted him saying, "There's good money in it." And there was. Barker understood that fear is a commodity. Hope is cheap, but terror pays the rent. He tinted the MIB law. He made it darker. He added the shadows where there were none. This leads us to an uncomfortable question. A question that haunts every researcher who touches this subject. Did Gray Barker invent the Men in Black? Was the entire phenomenon a fiction, a ghost story spun by a cinema booker to sell paperbacks? Did he take a few random encounters with government security and blow them up into an interdimensional invasion? It would be comforting to think so. It would be easy to dismiss the Men in Black as the invention of a brilliant huckster. But the timeline doesn't allow for that simplicity. Barker didn't invent Maury Island. He didn't invent the slag that killed the dog. He didn't invent the terror that made Albert Bender waste away in his attic. Barker didn't create the monster. He just gave it a suit. He gave it a brand. But in doing so, he may have done something even stranger. By focusing the collective attention of thousands of people on these dark figures, by giving them a name and a shape, Barker may have engaged in a mass act of unintentional magic. He created a thought form. If you tell a story enough times and enough people believe it, does the story begin to take on a life of its own? As we move out of the 1950s and into the psychedelic era of the 1960s, the Men in Black change again. They stop behaving like the characters in Barker's noir detective novels. They stop acting like the G-men he wrote about. The fiction begins to bleed into reality. The entities that appear in the next decade are not the pristine agents of the State Department. They are glitching. They are wrong. They are simulacra that seem to be struggling to maintain their form. Gray Barker may have written the script, but something else decided to play the role. And the actors it sent were not human. The 1950s were defined by the Cold War. The fear was political. It was the fear of the dossier, the blacklist, the man in the trench coat who could ruin your life with a single phone call. Gray Barker understood that fear, and he packaged the Men in Black to fit perfectly inside it. He sold us a story about government suppression, about the state keeping secrets. But as the calendar turned to the 1960s, the phenomenon began to mutate. The reports that started coming in didn't fit the narrative of the FBI or the Air Force anymore. The agents were no longer acting like agents. They weren't even acting like human beings. The Men in Black entered the era of high strangeness. They ceased to be enforcers of the state and became something far more terrifying. They became simulacra, imperfect copies. Like a computer program trying to render a human being but getting the resolution wrong. They were glitches in reality. And nowhere was this more apparent than in the terrifying visitation of Dr. Herbert Hopkins. In September of 1976, Dr. Hopkins was living in Old Orchard Beach, Maine. He was a man of science, a psychiatrist and a hypnotist, consulting on a UFO teleportation case. He dealt in the mechanics of the mind, in logic. But logic left the building the moment the phone rang. A man was on the line identifying himself as the vice president of the New Jersey UFO Research Organization. He asked to come over to discuss the case. Dr. Hopkins, thinking nothing of it, agreed. He hung up the phone and walked to the back door to switch on the porch light. And the man was already there. This was the first violation of physics. In the seconds it took to cross the room, a man had arrived from nowhere. There was no car in the driveway. The nearest public phone was miles away. Yet there he stood, climbing the steps as the light flickered on. He was wearing a black suit, but it fit him poorly, hanging off his frame like clothes on a wire hanger. He wore a black hat, but it was his face that stopped the doctor cold. The man was entirely hairless. He had no eyebrows, no eyelashes. His skin was described as dead white, possessing the pallor of a corpse or wet plastic. But the most grotesque detail was his mouth. His lips were ruby red, a bright, garish crimson that looked painted on. As the interview progressed, the man took a grey glove from his pocket and wiped his mouth. When he pulled the glove away, the redness smeared across his cheek. It wasn't blood, it was lipstick. Dr. Hopkins realized with a jolt of nausea that the man had no lips. He had a slit for a mouth, and he had painted lips onto his face to pass as human. It was the disguise of a monster trying to look like a man and failing. The entity then instructed Hopkins to take a penny from his pocket and place it in the palm of his hand. "Watch the coin," the man said. Hopkins watched. The copper penny began to vibrate. It turned blue. Then it went fuzzy, losing its edges, dissolving into a shimmering vapor. And then it was gone. "Neither you nor anyone else on this plane will ever see that coin again," the entity stated. This was not government intimidation. This was a demonstration of power over matter. It was a magic trick performed by a dead thing. As the visit concluded, the entity began to fail. His speech became slurred, slowing down like a record player being unplugged. His posture sagged. He stood up, unsteadily, gripping the chair. "My energy is running low," he droned. "Must go now. Goodbye." He walked out into the darkness. There was no sound of a car starting, no footsteps, just the silence of the Maine woods swallowing him whole. While Dr. Hopkins faced the absurd, others faced a cruelty that was distinctly precise. If the Hopkins entity was a malfunctioning robot, the visitors to Robert Richardson in Toledo, Ohio, were sadists. In 1967, Richardson had collided with a UFO while driving at night. The object vanished, but it left a piece of itself behind. A small lump of metal at the impact site. Richardson submitted it to the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization for analysis. A week later, at 11 o'clock at night, 2 men in black suits arrived at his door. They didn't ask if he had the metal. They demanded it. When Richardson explained that he had already sent it to the lab, the men became visibly angry. But it wasn't a human anger. It was a cold, calculated fury. They knew he had sent it. They knew the exact time and date. They possessed an omniscience that no surveillance team could replicate. Then, one of the men leaned in. He didn't threaten Richardson with prison. He didn't mention the FBI. He looked at the man's life and found the thing he loved most. "If you want your wife to stay as pretty as she is," the entity said, "then you'd better get the metal back." It is a threat of such specific misogynistic violence that it feels shocking coming from a monotone figure. It targets the human fear of mutilation, of loss. It proves that whatever these things are, they understand our psychology well enough to know exactly where to insert the knife. But sometimes the mask slips completely, revealing not just cruelty, but machinery. In Wildwood, New Jersey, the Christiansen family had a visitation following a sighting. The man who arrived claimed to be from the Missing Heirs Bureau, a nonsensical cover story that fell apart immediately. The family nicknamed him Tiny. It was a nervous joke. The man was enormous, at least 6'6", looming over them in the hallway. He wore a coat that was far too thin for the freezing winter weather, yet he did not shiver. He did not seem to register the cold at all. As he sat in their living room, one of the family members noticed a detail that should have been impossible. Running from the man's leg, down into his sock, was a green wire. A wire, indenting the skin, suggesting that under the cheap suit and the pale flesh, there was something electric, something built, not born. The interview was a disaster. The entity's voice was metallic and monotone, a computer trying to synthesize speech. Suddenly, he stopped. His face began to turn bright red. A deep, alarming flush that spread from his neck to his forehead. He paused, reached into his pocket, and produced a single yellow pill. He swallowed it dry, without water. Almost instantly, his face returned to its dead white pallor. It was a maintenance cycle, a biological construct struggling to maintain homeostasis in an alien environment. The tiny entity wasn't just a strange man. He was a malfunctioning machine. If they have wires, do they have stomachs? This question was answered in Minnesota in a moment of surreal domestic horror involving a Mrs. Butler and a man calling himself Major Richard French. During a visit to investigate a sighting, Mrs. Butler, being a polite hostess, offered the Major a bowl of Jell-O. The entity stared at the bowl. He picked it up, and then he attempted to drink it. He tilted the bowl to his lips, expecting a liquid, and was visibly confused when the gelatinous solid did not flow. He didn't understand the physics of the food. He didn't understand how to use a spoon. Mrs. Butler had to teach the government agent how to eat dessert. She later described hearing a sound coming from his stomach. Not digestion, but a sloshing sound, like water in a tank, as if the man was hollow. For all these stories, for all the talk of wires and lipstick and jello, there was never any proof. The men in black were ghosts. They appeared, they terrified, and they vanished. Until Jersey City, 1968. Jack and Mary Robinson were being harassed. A man in black had been standing across the street from their apartment for 3 consecutive days. He was motionless, stiff, watching. Their apartment had been ransacked, papers shuffled, but nothing stolen. They were living in a state of siege. Desperate, they called a friend, Timothy Green Beckley, a researcher with a camera. Beckley arrived. He saw the figure, and he did what no one else had managed to do. He snapped the shutter. The resulting image is grainy. It is black and white. It shows a man in a dark coat and sunglasses standing stiffly in a doorway. It is ambiguous. It is blurry. But it is there. It is considered one of the only authentic photographs of a man in black entity. It captures the essence of the phenomenon. A dark, indistinguishable shape standing on the threshold of our lives, waiting. By the end of the 1970s, the government agent theory was dead. Government agents don't have green wires in their legs. They don't drink jello. They don't paint their lips on. These were not men. They were puppets. And if they were puppets, the terrifying question remained, who was pulling the strings? By the late 1960s, the nuts and bolts theory of ufology was collapsing under the weight of its own absurdity. If the men in black were government agents, they were incompetent. If they were aliens, they were nonsensical. Advanced biological entities capable of interstellar travel do not come to Earth to drink jello and threaten housewives about their physical appearance. The data was too weird. It refused to fit into the filing cabinets of the FBI or the scientific journals of the astronomers. The phenomenon demanded a new vocabulary, and it found its interpreter in a man who walked the moth-infested bridges of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. John Keel. Keel was not a scientist. He was a demonologist of the atomic age. He looked at the lipstick, the wires, and the disappearing coins, and he realized that we were asking the wrong questions. We were looking up at the stars, expecting visitors from Mars, when we should have been looking sideways, into the shadows of our own reality. Keel proposed a radical hypothesis. He called them ultra-terrestrials. He argued that the men in black are not from another planet. They are from here. They have always been here. They share this planet with us, occupying a part of the electromagnetic spectrum that is usually invisible to the human eye. They are the neighbors we cannot see. In the Middle Ages, they appeared as demons or fairies. In the 19th century, they were phantom airships. And in the paranoid, technological 20th century, they put on the costume that we expected to see. They put on the black suit. They drove the black car. They became the men in black, because that is what our culture feared. Keel called them cosmic pranksters. He suggested that the absurdity of the encounters, the drinking of the jello, the singing of the wires, was not a mistake. It was a performance, a piece of theater designed to confuse, to terrify, and to mislead the witness. They are not trying to hide the truth. They are trying to drive us insane with it. They are jamming our radar with nonsense so that we never see the signal. But if they are a performance, who is writing the script? This brings us to the most unsettling theory of all. A theory that suggests the men in black are not just watching us. They are of us. In Tibetan mysticism, there is a concept known as the tulpa. It is a thought form, a mental construct that is visualized with such intensity, such focus, that it eventually gains mass. It gains weight. It steps out of the mind of the creator and enters the physical world. Think back to Albert Bender in his attic. Think of the 20 clocks ticking. Think of the obsessive focus, the months of isolation, the sheer, unadulterated paranoia of the International Flying Saucer Bureau. Bender wasn't just writing newsletters. He was pouring his psychic energy into a vessel. He was terrified that the government would silence him. He was terrified of dark figures. And so the universe gave him exactly what he imagined. The theory suggests that the men in black are Tulpas. They are the psychic waste of the UFO community. We spent 50 years staring into the abyss, terrified that someone was watching us back. And our collective fear, our egregore, coalesced into these pale, stiff, mechanical figures. This explains why they run out of energy. A thought form needs a thinker to sustain it. When the fear subsides, the man in black fades. He walks out the door and vanishes because the battery of our belief has run dry. It explains why they look wrong, why they have no lips, why they move like bad actors. They are imperfect because they are drawn from our imperfect nightmares. We didn't know how an alien should drink jello, so the Tulpa didn't know either. We are the authors of our own haunting. The silencers are not an external force crushing the truth. They are the antibodies of our own skepticism, the manifest guilt of a species that knows it shouldn't be looking where it's looking. It is a theory that turns the victim into the villain. Albert Bender didn't discover the men in black. He built them, and Gray Barker, with his trickster books and his fabricated letters, fed them. He gave them a legend to inhabit. He gave them a shape. But legends have a way of twisting. And just when the world thought it understood the game, the man who started it all returned from the shadows. Albert Bender, silent for 9 years, opened his door again. And the story he told wasn't about the government. It wasn't about Tulpas. It was about something so strange, so hallucinatory, that it would shatter his reputation forever. He was about to take us to planet Kazik. The year is 1962. It has been 9 years since Albert K. Bender shut down the International Flying Saucer Bureau, burned his files, and retreated into silence. The UFO community has moved on. The men in black have become a fixture of the law, a terrifying archetype of government suppression. Everyone thinks they know why Bender was silenced. He knew too much. He had the proof. But then Bender did the unthinkable. He came back. He published a book titled Flying Saucers and the Three Men. The title promised answers. It promised the revelation that had been denied to the world for nearly a decade. The faithful lined up to buy it, expecting a gritty exposé of government cover-ups, of secret bases, of the dark truth behind the silence. What they got was madness. The book was not a whistleblower's account. It was a fever dream. Bender abandoned the narrative of the G-Man entirely. He claimed that the three men in black were not from the FBI. They were not from the CIA. They were from a planet called Kazik. Kazik. It sounds like something from a pulp magazine, a name that belongs in a Flash Gordon serial, not a serious investigation. But Bender was serious. He described being transported, physically or astrally, it's never quite clear, to a secret base in Antarctica, a shimmering underground complex hidden beneath the ice. There, he was not interrogated. He was initiated. He described being stripped naked. He described being massaged with a strange ointment by the inhabitants of the base. The details are sensual, bizarre, and deeply uncomfortable for the conservative UFO community of the early 1960s. He described the beings not as monsters, but as beautiful. He claimed they had 3 distinct sexes, male, female, and a third, exalted state that combined the best qualities of both. He met their leader, a figure he called the Exalted One, a being of immense power and beauty who presided over the base like a high priest. The reaction was immediate and brutal. The book destroyed Albert Bender's reputation. The man who had been the martyr of ufology was now the laughingstock. The community that had revered his silence now mocked his speech. They said he had snapped. They said he was delusional. Even Gray Barker, the man who had built his career on Bender's story, privately rolled his eyes. He published the book because he knew it would sell, but he whispered to his friends that Bender had lost his mind. But had he? If we strip away the 1950s sci-fi vocabulary, the planet Kazik, the exalted one, what are we left with? Bender describes being taken to a hidden realm, Antarctica/underground. He describes being anointed with oils, a classic ritual of initiation. He describes encountering beings of impossible beauty and fluid gender. He describes receiving secret knowledge that he is forbidden to share. This is not a story about aliens. This is a story about the Fae. It aligns perfectly with the folklore of centuries past, the abduction by fairies, the journey to the Hollow Hill, the transformative experience that leaves the witness changed, unable to reintegrate into normal society. Albert Bender wasn't lying. He was trying to describe a shamanic, interdimensional experience using the only language he had, the language of pulp science fiction. He experienced something profound, something that shattered his reality. And when he tried to translate that experience into English, it came out sounding like a bad B-movie. The tragedy of Albert Bender is not that he was silenced. It's that when he finally spoke, no one understood the language. He was trying to tell us that the phenomenon is not political. It is spiritual. It is transformative. But the world wasn't ready for spiritual. The world wanted the G-Man. The world wanted the conspiracy. And the world was about to get exactly what it wanted, but in a way that would strip the men in black of all their terror. The silence was broken. The madness was revealed. And now, the only thing left for the men in black to do was to sell out. As we move into the modern era, the shadows retreat. The high strangeness fades, and the men in black prepare for their final transformation, not into monsters, but into movie stars. The journey of the men in black is a study in how capitalism processes and neutralizes folklore. It takes the sharp, terrifying edges of high strangeness and sands them down until they are safe for mass consumption. In 1990, the men in black underwent their most radical transformation yet. They moved from the pages of obscure UFO newsletters to the four-color panels of a comic book. Lowell Cunningham wrote The Men in Black. He knew the law. He had read Barker. He had read Keel, but he chose to twist it. In his version, the MIB were not the victims of a cosmic prank. They were the perpetrators. They were a secret organization, yes, but they were not the heroes. They were ruthless. They operated in the shadows to keep the truth from the public, often killing witnesses rather than just silencing them. They were morally ambiguous, reflecting the darker side of conspiracy culture. But Hollywood has a way of rewriting the script. In 1997, the film adaptation starring Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones hit theaters. It was a blockbuster. It was funny. It was charming. And it was the death knell for the true men in black. The movie flipped the narrative completely. The MIB became the good guys. They were the thin black line defending the Earth from the scum of the universe. The terrifying silence of Maury Island, the threat against children, became a punchline. The neuralizer, a device that wipes memory, turned the act of silencing into a humorous plot device to prevent panic. The aesthetic of high strangeness was stripped away. The drinking of Jell-O, the painted lips, the robotic movements, all of it was played for laughs. The aliens became gross-out gags, sugar water drinking bugs in human suits. The terror of the uncanny valley was replaced by special effects. The movie Men in Black is the ultimate success of the real Men in Black. By turning the phenomenon into a joke, a toy line, and a catchy rap song, the true, unsettling nature of the silencers was effectively neutralized in the public consciousness. After 1997, reporting an MIB encounter became culturally synonymous with referencing the movie. If you told someone you saw a man in black, they would quote Will Smith. The cultural signal was jammed. Genuine research became nearly impossible because the noise of pop culture was too loud. The Men in Black won, not by silencing us with threats, but by making us laugh. So where does that leave us? We have traveled from the cold waters of Maury Island to the ticking attic of Albert Bender. We have seen the trickster antics of Gray Barker and the terrifying glitches of the high Strangeness era. We have explored the theory that we created them, that they are the tulpas of our own fear. And we have watched them evolve into movie stars. But the phenomenon is not gone. It has simply changed its suit. The Men in Black are not just government agents. They are not just aliens. They are the antibodies of reality. They are the mechanism by which the universe corrects itself. When we look too closely at the seams of our existence, when we start to see the things we're not supposed to see, the universe sends a correction. It sends a silencer. Maybe they are tulpas. Maybe they are interdimensional guardians. Or maybe they are exactly what Albert Bender feared in the beginning. They are the things that watch us back. The next time you feel a sudden chill in a warm room, the next time your phone rings and there is no one on the line, the next time you see a car that looks just a little too perfect, driving down a street that is just a little too quiet. Don't look too closely. Don't ask too many questions, because silence is your best security, and they are still watching.